Welcome back. In this section, we will explore the concept of traumatic events and how they impact law enforcement and corrections staff. We'll begin by defining what a traumatic event is and examine how exposure to these events is an inevitable part of the job. We will then discuss the types of traumatic events that officers and corrections staff commonly encounter, ranging from critical incidents involving violence, serious injury, or death, to the cumulative stress of repeated exposure to human suffering. And, finally, we will examine the common responses that staff may experience after such events, including both normal and problematic reactions. This section will provide a solid foundation for understanding trauma's impact on professionals and the importance of support and recovery strategies. Let's get started. Let's begin with the question, what is a traumatic event? According to the DSM-5 and supported by the World Mental Health Survey Consortium, a traumatic event is any experience involving actual or threatened death, serious physical injury, or sexual violence. This exposure may occur in multiple ways: directly experiencing the event, witnessing it, learning it happened to someone close, or repeatedly confronting vivid details, an experience common among first responders and correction staff. In a global study across 24 countries with nearly 69,000 participants, over 70% had experienced at least one traumatic event, and 30.5% had endured 4 or more. The most frequently cited incidents included witnessing death or serious injury, unexpected death of loved ones, robbery, life-threatening accidents, and serious illness. Professional exposure for law enforcement officers and correctional staff is drastically different. Their trauma is direct, repeated, and often life-threatening. According to research by Brian Chopko, Patrick Palmieri, and Richard Adams, police officers are exposed to an average of 178 critical incidents throughout their career, while the average person encounters 2 to 3 traumatic events in their life. Police officers suffer PTSD at rates between 12 and 35%, 2 to 4 times higher than the general population. A 2021 study titled Police Stress and Deleterious Outcomes: Efforts Towards Improving Police Mental Health noted exposure to a career average of 30 suicide scenes per officer. Correctional staff fare even worse. 19 to 34% meet PTSD criteria, depression affects around 25 to 36%, and suicide risk is significantly higher than in other occupations. A 2019 SLU study found that 53% of jail officers screened positive for PTSD, far above the 6.8% rate in the general U.S. population. This level of repeated exposure leads to compartmentalization, emotional suppression, compassion fatigue, moral distress, moral injury, and perpetrator-induced trauma, all of which compound the psychological burden. Why the differences matter. For police officers and correction staff, trauma is not a single event or occasional occurrence. It's a constant reality of the job. These professionals face repeated exposure to violence, human suffering, and critical incidents that leave lasting psychological imprints. Compounding this burden are organizational stressors, such as shift work that disrupts sleep cycles, chronic understaffing that increases workload and pressure, internal investigations that can feel adversarial, and fractured leadership that sometimes fails to prioritize staff well-being. Together, these stressors intensify the psychological toll of the profession. The effects of sustained trauma exposure are profound. Officers and corrections staff are at heightened risk for PTSD, depression, burnout, substance misuse, and sleep disorders. Over time, chronic stress can also take a severe physical toll, contributing to conditions like heart disease, hypertension, and even a shortened life expectancy. For example, studies by the Vera Institute of Justice and Benchmark Analytics reported that the average life expectancy for correctional staff hovers around 59 years, well below the national average, underscoring the cumulative impact of occupational stress on overall health. Adding to these challenges is the persistent stigma around seeking help. Many officers fear that admitting to mental health struggles will jeopardize their careers or mark them as weak in the eyes of their peers. This stigma fosters a code of silence that keeps officers from accessing the support they need, often until the situation reaches a crisis point. Understanding the magnitude of trauma exposure in law enforcement and corrections highlights the urgency of systemic change. Although we have already touched on a few, let's take a deeper look at the types of traumatic events. Think of how many of these you have encountered in your law enforcement or corrections career. Traumatic events come in many forms, affecting people differently based on the nature of the experience and their own circumstances. Some involve acts of intentional violence, like torture or domestic violence, where harm is inflicted by another person. Others are caused by unpredictable natural forces, such as earthquakes, floods, or hurricanes. House fires or acts of arson also represent traumatic experiences, often leaving victims grappling with sudden loss and fear. Serious medical events, such as life-threatening illnesses, surgeries, or unexpected health crises, can shake a person's sense of safety and control. Likewise, vehicle accidents, which may involve severe injuries or fatalities, can leave lasting psychological scars. Events like terrorism or mass violence shock entire communities, leaving survivors and witnesses to process unimaginable horror. The sudden and unexpected death of a loved one is another profound trauma that can leave people feeling overwhelmed and unprepared. Sexual and physical abuse or assault are deeply personal violations that disrupt a person's trust and sense of self. Similarly, witnessing or discovering death, such as encountering a deceased person or dealing with fatalities at work, can have a lasting impact. Finally, seeing or experiencing violence, whether it's a homicide, suicide, or brutal attack, can leave a witness deeply affected, regardless of whether the event was experienced firsthand or observed. These events often overlap and compound one another, shaping the way trauma is experienced and processed. Understanding the variety of traumatic events helps illustrate why individuals, especially those in high-risk professions like law enforcement and corrections, can be so deeply affected by what they encounter. Let's now look at some of the common responses to a traumatic event and how responses may differ between law enforcement, corrections, and the average person. When an average individual experiences a traumatic event, such as a car accident, natural disaster, or personal loss, they often react with intense and sometimes confusing emotional, physical, and cognitive responses. Immediately after the event, they might feel relieved just to be alive, followed by waves of fear, anger, or sadness. Typical reactions include difficulty sleeping, jumpiness, intrusive memories or flashbacks, a racing heart, and a heightened sense of vulnerability. Over time, many people gradually recover with the support of family, friends, or mental health professionals. Most return to their usual routines within weeks, although some may need longer. A minority, about 5 to 6% of the U.S. population, go on to develop chronic conditions such as PTSD, particularly if they experience persistent avoidance behaviors or self-blame. Unlike civilians, law enforcement officers and corrections staff regularly encounter violent crime scenes, suicides, assaults, and sometimes the deaths of colleagues or inmates. They also carry the weight of witness accounts, body recovery, and high-stress situations, all without the luxury of time to process each incident. Common behavioral and emotional responses include emotional numbness, irritability, difficulty concentrating, disrupted sleep, fatigue, and changes in appetite or personal care. Acutely, they may experience hypervigilance, sudden anger, or a sense of detachment from normal daily life. There are a number of key differences between civilians and first responders in how and why they respond differently. The first relates to exposure frequency and directness. Trauma can impact anyone, but the way it unfolds for civilians is often quite different from how it affects those in law enforcement and corrections. Civilians typically encounter trauma as a single, episodic event such as a car accident, a natural disaster, or a personal loss. These experiences, while profoundly distressing, usually occur outside the context of their daily work lives and allow time to process and heal. In stark contrast, law enforcement officers and corrections staff face repeated and direct exposure to violence, death, and moral distress as part of their job. For them, trauma is not a rare occurrence, but a constant occupational hazard that can leave deep psychological imprints over time. The next one relates to emotional and behavioral manifestations. The emotional and behavioral responses to trauma also diverge significantly. The general population often experiences stress reactions that are intense but temporary, such as nightmares, anxiety, or hypervigilance, that gradually subside with support from friends, family, or therapy. However, public safety personnel often develop chronic and more complex symptoms: emotional numbing that makes them feel detached or disconnected, persistent hyperarousal that leaves them on constant alert, irritability that strains relationships, and deeper issues like burnout and compassion fatigue that sap their motivation and energy. And finally comes the difference in coping and support networks. When it comes to coping and support networks, civilians usually have access to informal support like family, friends, and community resources, and can seek therapy without fear of being labeled weak. In contrast, officers struggle to access timely, confidential support because of the cultural stigma around vulnerability and the fear of professional consequences if they admit to needing help. This barrier prevents many from seeking timely care, leading to a cycle of unaddressed trauma that can impact their well-being, their work, and the communities they serve. While most people recover from traumatic events using their existing support systems, law enforcement and corrections professionals face cumulative trauma that wears on their mental and physical health over time. Their responses, compassion fatigue, burnout, PTSD, are intensified by the repeated nature of their exposure and the cultural and structural barriers to seeking help. Recognizing these differences is crucial for developing effective wellness programs, peer support, and leadership-driven policies that build resilience and prevent long-term harm in those who serve and protect us. While most people recover from traumatic events using their existing support systems, law enforcement and corrections professionals face cumulative trauma that wears on their mental and physical health over time. As these stressors accumulate, many officers experience burnout marked by exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced performance, and sometimes escalate into serious mental health conditions. Compassion fatigue, the cost of caring, can emerge swiftly when repeatedly exposed to human suffering and left unchecked, can lead to PTSD, depression, substance misuse, or even physical health issues like cardiovascular disease. Recognizing these differences is crucial for developing effective wellness programs, peer support, and leadership-driven policies that build resilience and prevent long-term harm in those who serve and protect us. As we prepare to close, let's recap what we covered in this section. We explored the complex issue of trauma and how it affects both civilians and law enforcement professionals. We began by defining what constitutes a traumatic event, highlighting that it typically involves actual or threatened death, serious injury, or violence. While civilians may encounter trauma occasionally or in isolated circumstances, law enforcement and corrections staff experience trauma as a regular part of their work, often repeatedly and directly. We discussed the differences between civilian and first responder responses to trauma. Civilians often rely on natural support systems like family and friends, and may seek therapy without fear of stigma. Their stress reactions, while distressing, usually resolve over time. In contrast, law enforcement professionals face repeated exposure to violent incidents, death, and moral conflicts that can lead to more complex reactions, including emotional numbing, hypervigilance, irritability, burnout, and compassion fatigue. We also examined why these differences matter, emphasizing that repeated exposure, combined with organizational stressors and stigma, can intensify mental health risks for officers. These factors not only impact the individual, but can affect entire teams, agencies, and community relationships if left unaddressed. Next, we explored the types of traumatic events that officers frequently encounter, from witnessing homicides and suicides to responding to serious accidents, domestic violence, and mass violence incidents. Importantly, we noted that law enforcement professionals experience these events at a much higher rate than civilians, compounding the potential for long-term mental health consequences. This section has laid the groundwork for understanding the unique nature of trauma in the law enforcement profession and underscored the importance of targeted mental health support for those who serve and protect. In the next section, we will shift our focus to when it's time to seek assistance and what effective support looks like for law enforcement and corrections professionals. We will begin by discussing the risks of self-medicating and engaging in destructive coping behaviors. This includes understanding how substance misuse, alcohol abuse, and even aggressive behavior can mask deeper issues and why these strategies often do more harm than good. From there, we will explore what peer support truly means in the context of public safety. We'll clarify that peer support is not therapy or counseling, but a structured program where trained colleagues provide confidential, judgment-free listening and support. Peer supporters offer an empathetic ear and can bridge the gap between struggling officers and the professional help they may need. We will also compare and contrast peer support and counseling to highlight the unique roles each plays. While peer support helps reduce stigma and foster trust, professional counseling offers the expertise and therapeutic approaches that are sometimes necessary for healing and recovery. The upcoming section will empower you to recognize the signs that help is needed, understand your options, and see how both peer and professional resources can work together to support mental wellness in high-stress professions.